guys, I'm Amber, this is Amber Online, and today we're going to be talking about Guillermo del Toro's Crimson Peak. So, when Guillermo del Toro does anything, I am on board with it. And since he co-wrote this, and then he also directed this, and then he also produced this, I'm like all over the board with it. I was very excited to go and see this, so you may consider that a bias during my review of it, if you are so inclined. But just to get this out of the way up front, this was a wonderful movie. It was thought-provoking, it was fun to watch, it didn't drag at any point, it was just very well executed. The cinematography was beautiful. This is a period piece, so the shots that they did of sort of this Victorian or post-Victorian era US and England were phenomenal. The old buildings looked great. The costuming was fantastic. If you've looked at anything about this film, I'm sure you read stuff about costuming because it's constantly being mentioned, because it was so well done and also so used as part of the characterization and just the design of the actors and their dress, and the fact that Mia Wasikowska's character, who played Edith, who was a primary female protagonist, had just this beautiful golden hair, and she was always in whites and yellows and very angelic. And Jessica Chastain, who played Lady Lucille, who was a primary female antagonist, was always in blacks and has the dark hair and was always in darker colors and sort of buttoned up, and just sort of figure through her entire portrayal just through her costuming. And of course the costuming on the men is very period as well. And men look amazing in period costuming, and Tom Hiddleston and Charlie Hunnam are no exception. And I'm not going to harp on about this, but they look fantastic. And that's all I'm going to say about that. It's just, they made you feel for these characters and love these characters even though they were very messed up, damaged people. So the premise of this movie, which is going to have spoilers because I don't, if you've ever watched my channel before, I can't differentiate between spoilers and non-spoiler content. I don't have that kind of discipline. So go and see the movie first and then watch this to have some extra things to think about after. But the essential premise of this movie is that Edith is married off to Tom Hiddleston. They fall in love. He's come to the States looking for money to get an invention going to help him mine clay on his ancestral estate, and she falls in love with him. Her father has reservations about it. He is murdered, and she goes with Tom Hiddleston and starts off her life with him. In this period, they have Dr. McMichael, who's sort of a childhood friend of Edith's / a love interest. He's always pursued her. She's never really been interested, and he sort of has reservations about her getting with Thomas Sharp, Tom Hiddleston's character. But because she's happy with him, he lets her go, but he's always kind of suspicious because, Edith's father died in mysterious circumstances, which is a murder, and Dr. McMichael, and he sort of tries to put this all together and figure out what's become of his childhood love. So this movie is packed with fun, like metatextual, intertextual references right at the beginning of the film. This is great if you like classic literature or if you studied literature at any point, and you want to sort of pick up these references. It's super fun. So at the beginning of the film, Edith is introduced to us as a writer, and sort of this woman who's clearly jealous of her awesome writing just makes a crack that she's like, oh yes, she's our very own Jane Austen. And then Edith is like, well, actually, I'd rather be a Mary Shelley. But that sort of opening gambit with the mention of those two female literary powerhouses indicates the basic themes of this film. So, Jane Austen, famous for her romances, Mary Shelley, famous for Frankenstein, and those are really nicely integrated in this film, that you have this love story and you have this monster story. And it's not a monster story in the way you suspect. And the film does also a really interesting job of making that happen. It says through Edith's writing, through her book, as she explains it when she's trying to get it published, what this film is going to be about. She says that it's a story with a ghost in it, but not a ghost story. She wants it to be a metaphor. The ghost is a metaphor for the past, which is essentially what it ends up being in this film. And at the same time, her editor suggests that she inject a little romance into it. And she's like, oh, it's just because I'm a woman, he wants me to put romance in. But then that's essentially what ends up happening, that she has this story that happens to have ghosts in it, that happens to have romance in it, but it is still essentially a story kind of about Jessica Chastain's character Lucille in the end, and her struggle with Edith and sort of their fight over Tom Hiddleston, over the character Thomas. So that's just a really fascinating layout. Like, at one point, Edith is still in the U.S. before she marries Tom Hiddleston, before she marries Thomas's character, and moves over to England, and she's talking with Dr. McMichael, and she's going through, like, the books on his shelves, and they're all about ophthalmology because he's an ophthalmologist. And then he has an Arthur Conan Doyle novel on there, and she mentions to him, "You fancy yourself a detective." And he just sort of laughs it off. And through the progression of the movie, you see that he starts investigating her father's murder. He starts putting together these clues about the identity of Thomas Sharp and who he was before or who he is and what he's done before he met Edith and brought her over to England, and has his own sort of detective subplot. And at one point, Thomas Sharp is critiquing Edith's book because her father asked him to break her heart and leave, and he says that you are just, writing, you don't know anything about love, you're just writing this fantasy story about a man with a pure soul who has to be redeemed by a woman. And again, that's essentially what happens in the film. Through the progression of the film, you learn that the Sharp family has essentially been going around to various countries and trying to get money to fund this machine to do clay mining on the ancestral estate. And through doing this, they've not been able to get funding because the machine's kind of a radical idea, but they've been going and marrying rich women. I say they, because Lucille's sort of been setting this up and pushing Thomas into marrying rich women, and then they bring them back, they take their money, and they poison them to death, and then he moves to another country and does this over and over again. And you learn that Lucille and Thomas had a very messed up childhood. They were essentially locked in the attic all the time with absentee parents. When Lucille was 14, she murdered their mother, and Thomas was sent away to boarding school, and she was institutionalized. And then when they got back together in the home, they continued a romance that had started through being each other's only companions. I know, guys, it has incest. I love things with incest. It's so messed up. It's like my favorite, most messed up thing. It's like, I don't know, it's great for creating a monstrous human being. So Lucille is unhinged, basically. She's murdered her mother as a child. She was institutionalized for a while, and then she's been killing these women that she's having her brother marry. And when she brings Edith back, of course, this is a turning point in the story, and Thomas falls in love with Edith. Through, I guess, Edith's purity and her newness and her difference and her unique self, he falls in love with her, and he doesn't want to kill her, and he starts trying to save her. And at the same time he's trying to save her, Dr. McMichael is coming in, and he's trying to save her, so he comes over from the States after following his trail of clues over to England to try and rescue her. And during this time, Edith has been being poisoned. She's been seeing ghosts in the house of these women that they've killed there, of the mother that died there. And the ghosts, by the way, are very cool. He doesn't shy away from showing you, and because this is a story with a ghost and not a story about a ghost, you see her mother as a ghost, you see Edith's mother as a ghost, you see Lucille and Thomas's mother as a ghost, you see some of the women they killed, and the ghosts are played by Doug Jones. He's the basis for the makeup and for the CGI. So it looks really, really, really cool. And it's a very cool, the ghosts are in there, and you have these creepy sequences where she's being haunted at night, and they're very unsettling. But again, that's not the thrust of the movie. The ghosts are not the villain in the movie. They're not the thing to be overcome. Lucille and Thomas are. And ultimately, it's just Lucille, because they sort of do a really good job of making you sympathetic to Thomas's character, that he was a little kid, and he was locked up, and his older sister was unbalanced, and she messed him up, and she bound him into this life, and she keeps threatening him that she's going to be taken away, and he's going to be hung for doing what he's done, and they only have each other, and he tries to break away from this, because essentially Edith is in love with him, and he's in love with her, and before Edith is aware of his sister act situation, his incest, she's sort of trying to convince him to leave Crimson Peak, and she's like, look, she's got a lot of money, and she's like, we can run away, we can do anything we want together. And he sort of takes that idea to heart. He still loves his sister, and at the end he sort of suggests, she's like, Edith has been attacked. McMichael's been attacked trying to save her. He's like, well, look, Lucille, we don't have to do this anymore. We can all just leave this place together. We'll leave it behind. We'll let it sink into the ground. Crimson Peak doesn't have to be, our legacy. We can do anything we want now. And this is, to me, a really cool point in the movie. And it's because it sort of shows both the best and the worst of romantic love. Edith fell in love with Thomas, and McMichael fell in love with Edith, and Lucille is also in love with Thomas, and Thomas once loved Lucille too. So McMichael has traveled across the world and been stabbed and is still trying to save Edith, and Edith, to her credit, ends up saving herself in this film, which I really appreciate. It wasn't just a movie about some guys coming in and saving this woman. She saves herself, but I think this was really good, the crux of the film, that we often talk about in our social society about the idea of familial love, about the parents' love for a child being able to overcome anything. Oh, your kid's a drug addict and they stole all your money and they attack you, but you still love them because you're your kid. And it's almost this way in this film. I don't think after Thomas sort of decides he doesn't want to kill Edith anymore, he has this turnaround. He recognizes that he loves her, even though he's in this messed up trapped relationship with Lucille, with his sister. He's trying to save her, and he appeals to her at one point, and he says, I need you to trust me one more time. And he's like, you can go, you can run away, go with McMichael, get out, or you can wait for me. And she chooses to wait for him. And this is kind of despite all the abuses she suffered from him, she still loves him. He's still her husband, and she still sees the good in him, I suppose, and I get the sense that she's still waiting for him to be redeemed, despite what she's seen him do and what he's done to her, because he had this turnaround, because he's a damaged individual trying to break the chains of this childhood that he had and be with her, and his choice is to be with her. She seems still sort of to want to love him, and to, in spite of everything, in spite of, being essentially that scenario of the abusive family member, she wants to love him. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, you have Lucille, who loves Thomas romantically as well, and goes into the jealous rage when she finds out she's been spurned, and she ends up ultimately killing him, because it's sort of if I can't have him, no one can, and she flips out and kills him accidentally. And I'm not saying this is good, because this is almost a battered woman scenario, that Edith chooses to wait for him. She's been poisoned by him. She's seen him getting it on with his sister while they're married. She knows that he's killed all these other women, but because he had this turnaround of character, she's willing to wait for him to see if this one last time he's sort of been redeemed. And I think that's a very romantic notion, if not necessarily a healthy or feminist one, but an interesting one to think about nonetheless, that we are so willing to do anything we can, even in a romantic love situation, for anyone we love, that Edith is willing to wait for him in spite of all he's done, because essentially he's and he plays it so well too. He's a person that is hurt, and she's a person who is well, and she's trying to help him because she loves him. And Edith is that angelic figure, right? That figure, that redeemer for him, that comes in and he says, you're so different. And she is that character in the story who, a man with a good soul, is just trapped inside this terrible life, and she's the one who saves him. She becomes basically the story he said she was writing. And then Lucille kills him and flips out and goes and attacks Edith, and Edith beats her to death with a shovel because she's hardcore and she's not going to stand for this crap. But that's essentially how the film ends, with Edith being the primary monster, and the primary conflict not being about ghosts, not being about the fact that Edith can see ghosts, not even being the romance, but being the struggle between these two women over this man, who was essentially, a pawn to Lucille that Edith was trying to redeem through her love. So you got a film that's a horror movie with ghosts and murder and Victorian intrigue and literary illusions that at its core about the healing power of love. And I know I can be inserting that message into it because I like stuff like that, but I think it's really cool, and it was a very effective film, and it was a lot of fun to watch. And Jessica Chastain played an amazing monster. Like, the sequences at the end where she's, like, running around all bloodied after killing Thomas and flipping out are great. She plays them perfectly, and she is scarier than any ghost in the movie. And the final showdown with Lucille and Edith is far more intense than the chase scenes by ghosts at night. There's a couple other things to note in this film. They, again, heavy on the symbolism with color, as I mentioned with the outfits for the ladies and the gentlemen, that they're just sort of like the light and dark side of things. You'll also be able to note that the ghosts in the film have distinct color palettes, so the women that have been killed in the house, all their ghosts are red because they've been left in the red clay vats, and that's pretty cool because they look all gory. And interestingly, when Thomas dies, he appears as the only white ghost in the film. He was the only one that was sort of all white and pale, and I think that is a pretty strong indicator of the fact that he was a pure soul trapped in a dark situation and was liberated by Edith's love because he was willing to stand up for his sister, to his sister because of it, and even though ultimately it got him killed, he was liberated and he got to be his true self at the end of his life. And then later when you see Lucille's ghost, it's the black ghost. She's a dark shadow attached to this world. So I've talked long enough about this, and I may cut some things out. And I may not, but I probably will because I'll get tired of putting like little pictures in the corner. But I hope this gave you some things to think about for this movie because it was really, really great. And I may be a little infamous for overthinking things, but I think there was a lot to see in here. There's a lot of great literary illusions. There was a lot of beautiful cinematography to see if you don't care about literary illusions. And there was a lot of, like, you know, hotties if you don't care about either of those things. So I hope you go and check it out and that you enjoy it, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye!